The moderator is JP Vries. He's the Director Emeritus and Distinguished Advisor at the Silicon Flatirons. JP has done foundational work, great foundational work in the area of risk relative to spectrum management. And I couldn't think of a better moderator for this topic. So JP, I'll turn the stage over to you.
Thank you very much, and great to be with everybody. Our panel today is going to be talking about risk assessment, and we have 5 panelists who have experience not only in government, but also in industry and working for both. And we're going to have a very conversational session today, I hope, and we hope to actually have time for audience Q&A as well. But let me just start briefly by, giving you sort of my 2 cents about how I got involved in this and what I think the intersection is between risk assessment and spectrum coexistence. I got involved doing, statistics when I was looking at the RF environment. And I got curious and thought, where else can one use statistics? And I came across this area of risk assessment, which, to my embarrassment, was new to me because it turns out that just about every regulated industry other than spectrum has been doing it for at least 40 years. And so I started learning about it. And sadly, our panelist, Prasad Kadambi, can't make it today. He was with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, who was a pioneer in this area. And as I learned about risk, and you'll have the experts talk about this, but the question I will have for all of them is, what does risk mean to you? To me, it comes from a seminal paper back in the early 80s that said that it talked about the risk triplet. So it's what are the things that can go wrong? How likely are they? And what are the impacts when they do go wrong? And what the fourth thing that one would add to that actually is, what do you do about it? How do you mitigate it? And so I think the reason why this really appealed to me is it seemed to be a useful way of complementing how spectrum coexistence is often studied or done, which is in terms of worst case. And worst case is, a particular point in this risk triplet. It's one of the things that can go wrong. It's the one with the worst severity you can possibly imagine, and you ignore the probability. And very often, the worst case is useful, because if you test for the worst case and you don't have to worry, then you're done. You don't have to do any more. But with that, what I'd like to do is to start with our panelists. I'll ask each of them a question or so, just to introduce them to you. And then we'll start having the conversation. I'll start with Rob Henry, who leads MITRE's risk analysis and management practice area. He's the principal risk manager at MITRE. And he's been doing this for a very long time in many, many industries for many agencies and departments. So, Rob, my question to you is, how do you go about introducing risk management into an organization that hasn't done it before?
Thanks for having me on the panel, and a great question, JP. The first thing is really to understand what the objectives of the organization you're trying to work with are. Because risk management is actually a measurement of your ability to fulfill on your objectives and your mission. If you actually don't understand that, risk analysis really doesn't play any role. And so understanding and putting it in the proper context is the first step. It's amazing how many times the first thing I ask people is, what are your objectives? And often they can't even articulate that. So that's an important thing to even get to, is what are we doing? And then figuring out what are the things that are going to prevent us from getting there. And so really connecting it, because risk management is all about achieving objectives. It's not about what's going to go wrong. It's about how do we achieve our objectives and remove those obstacles to it. So it's important to understand that, to place it in that context. And once you've done that, then they're more receptive, because they understand why you're bringing this analysis to you. They understand what you're actually trying to accomplish.
Yeah, thank you very much. And let's just go through the whole panel and then we'll get into the conversation. The second person I'd like to introduce is Omar Alcala. He's at the FDA, Federal Drug Administration. He is a staff fellow and electrical engineer at the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. And in a way, Omar is our bridge between risk assessment done for all sorts of reasons and applying it to wireless purposes. So my question for you, Omar, is, why is the FDA looking at spectrum coexistence?
Okay. First of all, thanks for having me here today. And I think I want to start my answer by concurring with Rob. It is all about the mission and what it is that you're trying to achieve. The mission for the Center for Devices and Radiological Health is to protect and promote the public health. And when it comes to wireless medical devices, that falls under the purview of the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. And medical devices that have enabled wireless capabilities might introduce risks to patients. And when those wireless capabilities are in a scenario of wireless coexistence, so when two systems are sharing the same channel resources, they might impact each other's ability to fulfill those functions. And that's when we start to think about, okay, what would be the consequences of the delay or disruption of wireless communication in a medical device? What is the medical device trying to do with that wireless function? And what would be the consequences to the patient? And the patient harm is at the center of this whole perspective.
Great. Thank you very much, Omar. The next speaker or next panelist is Kelly Conson, who's principal professional staff at the Applied Physics Laboratory at Johns Hopkins. And Kelly actually led a very interesting project. It's in the references if you want to follow up, which was incorporating risk assessment into how the Department of Defense does spectrum studies. So Kelly, could you talk a little bit about why you did that and how you did that? You're muted.
Well, first and foremost, the why is because it was fun. But beyond that, what we realized when some of the legislation came through mandating some shared access to what was DoD spectrum, we had to step back and say, when you have a shared access or shared resource, everybody has to assume some level of risk. It's like driving to work every day, or back in the old days when we used to drive to work, there was always an assumption that everyone was willing to assume a certain amount of risk, some more than others. And you can't be too sensitive about what you consider a consequence, right, of having assumed that risk. Being mad because someone cut you off is one extreme, having a fatal accident is the other. There's a lot of space in between. We realize that same kind of principle applied to the sharing environment that we were asked to consider during the most recent AWS-3 related activities, as well as other things that the DoD has to consider in both congested and contested environments. So what we did is we decided to try to address what turned out to be basically a many-on-one problem, which was best tackled with statistics. And we had a wonderful working group that Howard McDonald and Greg Wagner talked about in supporting the spectrum sharing test and demonstration program within the Defense Spectrum Organization, where we actually identified the parameters that exhibit the most variability, characterized them statistically, and used statistical math and convolution, deconvolution, and representing things as random variables to try to express what the realistic probability of system impact, meaning system performance impact, would be. And the target was, in the vernacular you're most familiar with, JP, and that is to try to fill and quantify the likelihood access of that classic matrix between likelihood and consequences.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's great. And actually, you I think you've actually pressed a couple of Nick's buttons, so I'm gonna move to Nick and to hear from him for the first time around. Nick is an engineer at the NTIA Office of Spectrum Management, and I think the first question is, Kelly brought up statistics. So, from your point of view, Nick, why do we need probabilistic models at all?
Yeah, thanks for having us. I did love if we can just pull back to what Fred said about how, he said the status quo needs to change, right? The future static spectrum management paradigm won't work for DoD going in the future, right? And so when we think about risk, right, we aren't worried about, well, the status quo, right? But kind of the risks about the plans that we're going to do to change the status quo, right? So as we're going forward, that's how we're incorporating risk. But yeah, in terms of statistics, right? I think one of the power of probabilistic models is, well, we don't need to have perfect information in it, right? So there is that uncertainty built into the probabilistic model, which makes it nice for us, right? Especially with spectrum, we'll never have.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that reminds me of is one of the first things I read was a Nuclear Regulatory Commission paper, one of the early ones, and they had a chart, and it wasn't quite the risk matrix, which you can inveigh against later. It's not the 5 by 5, but what was really interesting was that they had probability, the likelihood on one axis, but it was orders of magnitude. Like 10 to the -1, 10 to the -2, 10 to the -3, and that was good enough for them. So you don't need precision. And one of the things that we'll come back to, Nick, is actually that's really interesting about your role is, you do these studies for lots of different groups of stakeholders, lots of different proceedings, and so on. And I want to turn to Kumar, who's a principal researcher at Ericsson Research and an expert in wireless communications networks. And, Kumar, you work a lot with spectrum coexistence and the tussles around that. And so in your experience, when you have lots of stakeholders, what tends to be the sticking points between them?
To me, I mean, it's largely, it's because of a lack of open information about building practices and the proprietary concerns between industries. Typically, these interfaces between services or between industries are where you face the most difficulties. So there is, very little transparency about what sort of study assumptions you're going to make, what parameters are important, and so on. And also, as it was pointed out, I mean, it's very difficult to agree on what the mission is, because if you have coexistence between more than one service, then typically the missions are different, right? So a typical example is between the satellite industry and the mobile industry, or between radio location and the mobile industry, as you have seen. The other issue, of course, is that there could be a large deployment of uncontrollable equipment that already have an incumbent status.
When you say uncontrollable, what do you mean?
In the sense that it's very difficult. So take the example of the GPS receiver case. If you want to put mobile systems close to that band, then you have a large number of consumer devices that are out there in the market that cannot be replaced. And you can expect some sort of a natural end of life process, but it takes time to achieve that. And then the other issue, of course, is ecosystem conditions. So you could have situations where you have radios out in the environment that cannot be very complex because of their use cases. Say if it's Internet of Things devices, or other cases, you'll have problems with having enough complexity in it to to actually handle very strict requirements on emissions and on receiver performance and so on. And lastly, I think a large part of this is also, it gets dictated by dogma. There are conflicting mission parameters that are thrown into the mix. So, for instance, there could be a statement which is made that sharing is a necessity, or that guard bands are bad, or or you might have other economic considerations such as competition and technology neutrality coming into the picture, which will subtract from spectrum efficiency as a whole. But those are, you have to be very clear on what you want to achieve at the end. And when you have conflicting requirements being thrown into the mix, you could end up in situations where you're not able to account for all the risks.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's circle back to Rob. And actually, I think this will be an invitation to all the panelists to respond to what you've just heard. But Rob, with your decades of experience and seeing this in many different industries, how do you respond to the kinds of things that you've been hearing from the other panelists?
Well, I think there's a number of things that you have to keep in mind is what often gets lost in risk analysis is what decisions being made. And so people aren't focused the risk analysis on the decision that actually needs to be, are we making what needs to be auctioned off? Are we doing a spectrum sharing decision? What are we doing? Or are we just trying to fit our known risk analysis to this one decision? So that is one thing that, people need to, keep in mind is, it's focusing on the decision and the outcome that needs to be made, connecting it back to that mission. The second thing is there's many types of risk analysis that some got spoken about. Gal was talking about some of the work that he was doing, as well. Of different types of risk analysis that aren't your traditional kind of 5x5 matrix kind of risk analyses that really are appropriate to represent different kinds of risk. And so understanding that and being able to understand the complexity and the interdependencies between some of these complex systems that we're dealing with in the spectrum space. So understanding that there may be multiple sources of risk that could result in the degradation or complete displacement of a particular signal, and understanding how those interact with each other, you can model those in a particular risk model, and there's different ways to do that. And
for people for whom risk analysis is new, let's say this is the first time they've heard anybody talk about it. What is risk analysis? Can you give an example that might make it more concrete?
Yeah, so risk analysis at its core is really the identification and characterization of something that's going to prevent a particular objective from being achieved. At its core, that's what it is. And there's a number of different types of things. We talked about a little bit earlier where you're identifying specific risks that have a particular probability or an impact, or you're looking at really kind of, I'll say, distributions of risk, that understanding that you could have all kinds of possible outcomes depending on a number of complex variables that are contributing to the things. And so all of these have different kinds of stuff. So there's a number of types. You have enterprise risk analysis, you have, probabilistic models, network analysis. There's numerous methodologies that can be applied in these spaces. But what's important is connecting it back to what we're trying to decide, and understanding that is the model that you're choosing, the old adage that models are always wrong but are often useful. It's understanding which ones actually apply to the decisions you're trying to make, and do they have enough fidelity to inform that decision. And so understanding the level of fidelity that you're incorporating into your analysis is also important. And what is
one of the things that a number of people mentioned, and Kumar in particular, was when there is no agreement on what the mission is or what the objective is, when there are different perspectives on what decision is being made. How do you tackle that?
Well, there's a number of different ways to tackle that. One is making sure the transparency and making sure that there's justification of why they think their mission is the most important. I've been in many, conducted many risk analysis with, I'll say, all the services in DoD, and let me say they did not agree on what was the most important, but they had to justify what they're doing. So, in making sure that it's transparent of saying this is why we think it is. Here's what it is. There's a number of different methodologies that you can do to really elicit preference and all those kind of stuff. There's a bunch of different approaches that can be done to do that. Additionally, like when you look at if you're talking in the commercial sector, you can also look at from a pricing perspective. How important is this? And you can actually model this in a non-commercial sector. We give you so much money. How much are you willing to spend to have this not be interrupted? Is it really that important to you or not? And when you really get down to it and you get an honest conversation going with these mission owners, not all their missions are created equal. Some, it's okay for them to occasionally be interrupted. Others are essential to never be interrupted. So and all of them know that, but when unfortunately we have an environment and culture that it's, you defend your turf to the last battle. And that's definitely prevalent in the spectrum space.
Yeah, and that's something I want to use to go back to Omar. One of the things that I'm very aware of in spectrum is that the arguments usually seem to be between different services, different kinds of operators, and the regulator, whether it's IRAC or the FCC or OSM, is the referee. And I used to think that other agencies it's easier there. Because there's the government and there's the industry and they have a debate. So and I think Omar was trying to educate me. That's not the case. So Omar, how do the dynamics work, and how does risk assessment fit into the dynamics at
Absolutely.
the Food and Drug Administration?
All right. So I happen to deal very, very often with a corner case of this risk assessment paradigm where you actually can sit around the table with different people that are trying to compete for their objective. Because it is very common in medical devices to use technologies that are wireless technologies that are off the shelf, often operating in unlicensed spectrum bands. So you lose that access to those other services and other competitors to the channel resources. And just to put a flavor on this, if you're looking at a patient side monitor that is trying to communicate the patient's vital signs wirelessly, that patient side monitor could be competing with someone in the hospital room streaming YouTube. And they have absolutely no control over what that person is trying to do. So when looking at this, we try to factor in what built-in mitigations to the risk of delayed or disrupted communication in the medical device are already introduced, how effective those mitigations are, and then look at the totality of the picture of what is the overall medical device trying to achieve, what does the wireless function of the medical device that is part of the bigger system trying to do, and then consider the risks of those functionalities. And when we embarked at FDA, when we started to think about spectrum coexistence, more specifically in unlicensed spectrum bands, which is, again, very commonly used in medical devices with technologies like Bluetooth and Wi-Fi, we try to reference that thinking to the tools that are commonly used by our stakeholders, by the medical device industry. And these are standards and technical reports that are often cited in regulatory submissions to the FDA. So we went about developing two primarily cited documents in this space. The first is from the American Association for the Advancement of Medical Instrumentation, AMI, Technical Information Report 69. I'm trying to avoid the use of acronyms. And that document really describes this whole conversation. It describes how wireless functions are part of medical devices, how the risk considerations should be taken into account, and then how it provides examples for different functionalities in different medical devices. And then it cites another standard for the testing and evaluation of wireless coexistence, and that one is the NCC 63.27. And I will conclude my thoughts here with these two documents, the risk analysis and management and the testing and evaluation. They have a one-to-one mapping. So when you're looking at a high-risk wireless function in a medical device, there is a direct link to a certain evaluation tier in the test standard. So the technical information report tells you, okay, go test this way. And that test severity, or how difficult the situation during testing decreases when you decrease the risk of the wireless function of the medical device.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, turning to Kali, one of the things that Omar tees up, I think, is, setting up your process in a way that is intelligible to your user base or your stakeholders, in a way that makes sense to them. If they're used to technical information reports, use that. I'm very interested in the work that you've done, Kali, with DoD, in how different stakeholders have responded to what you are trying to do. Human nature being what it is, some will be enthusiastic and some won't. What have been the kinds of ways in which people have responded to the introduction of risk into an area where it hasn't been before, explicitly at least?
I think it certainly wasn't a step function of approval by any means. I think in the areas where I've had the privilege to work with the DSO, I think there was a very good starting point when the Commerce Spectrum Management Advisory Committee, CSMAC, first met and developed these curves that were based on statistics, and everybody said, yeah, well, we're not talking about a worst case, everybody's transmitting at the same maximum power anymore. That was, in my mind, an icebreaker, and it showed a level of cooperation in this shared environment that maybe set the stage. And what I've seen, I'm hoping this answers the question, but what I've seen in the subsequent years, when this spectrum sharing test and demonstration program was being run, the stakeholders include the wireless operators, the individual services, the other agencies, NTIA and labs from ITS, and all of this. It took time, but all of us had made some progress and made some serious, I think, inroads in accepting the fact that there is a quest for realism, that if you want to do a realistic, and these are my words, not the words of DSO or anybody else, but if you want to do a realistic, incredible job of spectrum sharing, you have to be able to have realism on, for lack of a better description, on that likelihood axis. You have to be able to calculate probabilities based on realistic parameters that result in realistic statistical distributions, so that you can at least have a high fidelity, reliable answer that's been validated for how likely is it that you have some level of performance degradation. And you don't want to front load the parameters you're using by conflating the consequences, as you pointed out earlier, JP, with the actual calculation of probabilities that's necessary for quantitative risk assessment. And that theme grew within the stakeholder community. It's not over. We haven't perfected, we haven't touched all the parameters and most relevant parameters perhaps yet, but we've touched enough of them to see that there was more of an acceptance among all the stakeholders of pursuing that goal of realism in the quantitative assessment of what the probability of system degradation is.
Yeah.
And
And
let's worry
actually,
about consequences later. Let's not.
yeah,
conflict.
and so you've teed up so many things that I'd love to follow up on. I'll go to Nick next, but system degradation. Before I turn to Nick, because actually I think the curves, the CSMAC power curves, I think came out of your group, Nick. But
That was there
uh,
before me. So
oh,
yeah.
yes, yeah. But before we talk about those things, one of the things which I will invite the audience, if you have questions, please submit them in the Q&A, and we hope that we'll have a chance to address at least some of them. So, Nick, the things that you've been doing. So Callie's point about, there was a breakthrough. When you started being able to introduce these probabilities, and we'll talk about what realism means. From your point of view, you've got to do lots of studies, and usually you've got to do them very quickly, and you don't get do-overs, which actually goes against what this whole conference is about. But so when you think about, am I going to do a risk assessment, let's say a quantitative risk assessment, do the probability assessment versus doing a worst case, how do you balance the techniques that you use? How do you choose how to tackle the problem?
Yeah, well, of course, you never have to start out with a full-blown Monte Carlo analysis, right, for any spectrum sharing, right? We can always start out simple. I think just recently in Iraq, there was a great example of that in the higher gigahertz bands, right? It was just a basic, simple analysis done, right, in Excel, right? But again, we're trying to drive towards the best answer, right? So do we have to? I like to think of models as maps, right? So we use them to explore, right, possible scenarios, right? And
So
sometimes,
just, I'm sorry to interrupt, but the word
right.
model is a very overloaded. So when you say model, what
Mhm.
I think I have a picture of a map in my head, but what do you think of when you say model?
Yeah, well, so if we look at a spectrum sharing model, right, we have our link budget, right? We're looking at if there's harmful interference to the systems, right? So that could be, how do we model the incumbent systems? How do we model the other systems coming in? The propagation between those two. So yeah, that's the spectrum sharing model that we're talking about. But again, it's just a link budget, right? So it can be a very simple link budget.
Yep.
Whether it's free space or we have to do a terrain-based propagation model. But yeah, I think when we put the title final on a spectrum study, that's a no-no, right? Because it's iterative, right? Everything is iterative. Because we're always improving things. We can always improve, driving that uncertainty down, bringing us, like Callie said, closer to reality, right? Yeah, and we've been talking about stakeholders, and again, pulling back to Freddie, he said, this is a whole of nation concept, right? Yeah, for spectrum sharing, no one agency can do a spectrum analysis, right? No one small industry can do a spectrum analysis. We do need to bring all those subject matter experts to the table, right? Whether it's the wireless industry with Kumar, right? Or Callie from DoD and those radar experts, right? Will from Cisco a day or two back said, he was talking about the 6 gigahertz. There were 2 spectrum studies brought towards FCC. Again, there are these competing studies done by 2 different groups. And he, of course, asked, well, why couldn't the FCC or NTIA do that? Yes, that's something we could look at. But again, we can't do that feasibility assessment in a silo, right? We do need to bring everybody towards that. So yeah, the actual assessment really isn't that hard, right? The computer does all the work, right? Modeling it, we have all the tools in, right? So really, it's not a time crunch on me, right? It's how do we pull out that great data and the knowledge from our subject matter experts into the analysis, right? So then we can peer review it. So we can have reproducibility in science, right?
Yep.
And this is it's not fancy new ideas, right? We don't need new ideas all the time. We just need to kind of focus on the fundamentals of science, right? Hopefully that.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot more with everything that you're saying and everything everybody else is saying. I want to go back to a point that Kelly made and turn to Kumar. Kelly was saying, focus on the realism of likelihood, on the likelihood axis. And actually, one of the things that Kumar was mentioning as we were preparing for this is sort of, asking the question that. So I'll ask you, Kumar, the question that you asked. And I don't know if it's a rhetorical question, but is it possible to agree on the probability of risk in a coexistence discussion? Can we even agree? I think you're muted. You're muted, Kumar. Still muted. There you go, I think.
Yeah.
Yep.
Sorry. So between services, I think it has to be based on some sort of a negotiated process, right? I think the regulator's job is really ultimately towards efficient use of spectrum. But if you look at at what needs to happen before then, you have to allow this process of quotient bargaining happening between the parties and the stakeholders involved. And to a large extent, this is possible in certain scenarios. So, for instance, in 3GPP, we do Monte Carlo analysis of performance of mobile systems quite regularly. But you'll also find that despite the fact that everybody agrees on the models, everybody comes up with different answers. And then there is another process of reconciliation that happens where you compare results from various companies and you try to figure out what makes sense. And, sometimes there is just a consensus view that is developed, or there is an averaging of results, or outliers are thrown away and so on. But you need to establish the sorts of processes that allow for competing interests to do their own analysis based on agreed parameters for study, and then to take that and come up with rational outcomes from this. And in some cases, it's possible to do it. In other cases, it's a lot more difficult. So, for instance, when we run up against negotiations with federal holders of spectrum, typically the DoD, there is a fair amount of information hiding that goes on. I mean, this happens on both sides, right? In our case, in the mobile industry, we are working at the at the edge of the state of the art. So we are a little concerned about how much information we are willing to let to divulge to others. On the other hand, the DoD is dealing with sensitive systems, and they do not want knowledge about what is being actually done in constructing those radios from getting out into the public sphere. So the bargain that worked pretty well during the AWS-3 evaluations and CSMAC was that the NTIA and ITS would conduct the studies based on parameters that we provided, and that worked out. I think from a process viewpoint, it worked out pretty well. Then on the base, if you go deeper into how effective was the modeling, were the right models used, was it realistic, maybe you can start picking at the assumptions that went into that entire study. But on the whole, I think the process is pretty established. Another example is if you go over to Europe, because there are examples over there. And CPT, for instance, does the regulatory work. But then you have all these other groups that are set up, like SE7 for sharing and compatibility studies in mobile systems, or SE40 for space services, and SE21 for emissions and so on. So they've
So,
set up
sorry,
processes.
just to clarify, Kumar, these are, where are these groups? Are they, which organization are they part of?
They're part of the EU regulatory process, but
Okay.
they're you know, the studies that they conduct involve all the stakeholders, and they come up with quite detailed you know, agreements on what kind of models need to be considered, and I won't say that the outcome is always ideal in those cases as well, because they have to deal with some of the same roadblocks that we end up with if we were to conduct similar studies over here. But at least there is a process set up where real studies are conducted and regulatory decisions are made on the basis of evidence, rather than the FCC putting out, say, a consultation and then trying to make some sense of all the opinions or the you know, statements that are rendered in response to those consultations, right? So you have, I think there is room in this country to sort of set up some sort of a forum by which stakeholders can get together and actually conduct reasonable studies of situations where spectrum use might get into conflict with one another.
That's a very interesting idea, and let's get back to that. You know, I just want to circle back. You know, one of the themes, you know, for the last, you know, 10, 20 minutes actually has come from, was related to something that you said, Rob. You know, when I asked, so how, you know, how do you tackle disagreements? You said, you know, transparency, or one of the things you said. And, you know, several of the speakers have mentioned, you know, there are difficulties with transparency for commercial reasons, for national security reasons. You know, how does that work out in other fields that you've looked at? I mean, you've done national security work, you've done homeland security work. You know, so how does it play out there, where, you know, clearly this is very sensitive information? How are you transparent in that situation?
Yes, it's definitely always a challenge, and the transparency is both in the information provided and also the techniques that you're using. So there's two aspects of transparency in your analysis. So if it's a black box and they can't understand what happens, you know, and there's no logical understanding of what's being spit out of that analysis, it doesn't matter how sensitive the data that you have going into that process, that's not going to be used in decision making, because people don't trust the outcomes, they don't trust what's being produced, and they can't with confidence say, I'm going to do this. Now, getting to the sensitivity information. Yes, I've worked a lot of different things. I've worked the Intel community, I've worked, you know, the DoD, other things, and it's really across mostly industry and with sharing, using information from industry and the government together in analysis. You know, the key thing is, how do you compartmentalize parts of your analysis? So the key thing is you have to structure it in a way that you're able to, you know, sensitize that and make sure that that information is compartmentalized and it's not revealing things, and provide in your overarching analysis, representing them in that way that doesn't give away that sensitive information. You know, and so there are ways to do that. It does take time to structure it in a way. But the key thing when you do that, you have to watch out from that black box thing going on. So you need to make sure that it's not just, oh, we told you it was okay, so therefore it's okay. You know, because no one's going to believe you. You know, so you need some evidence to support your claims on that. So that's important on having multi parts on that, making sure it's structured in a way that people understand that, oh, okay, this is some information here. There's some additional detail. I'm able to represent maybe the level of risk, but not why it's at that level. Yeah, it's typically on that. And also, there's some things, you know, there's always important to push back a little bit on the sensitivity, especially in the national security space. A lot of the stuff that they say is sensitive. The classified piece is this little piece, and there's all this other information that is actually not classified. That that can be used in the analysis. So it's understanding where that is and understanding that piece of it as you go forward.
Thank you. So I will get back to sort of the fun I'm having as moderator, asking people questions, but let's just tackle a few of the questions that are in the Q&A. I'll read the question, and it's a jump ball. Let's just click through. Anybody can respond to a question. Actually, the first one, let me just see. Okay. I'll read this. Risk can be quantified at different levels, e.g., as any signal or combination of signals, service, application level, or even at the broader socioeconomic level. In the context of spectrum sharing, how do you unify or balance these disparate notions of risk across different services or technologies or stakeholders? So if different people have different views of the world, how do you bring them together? Anybody?
Well, I'll say always different levels of risk and understand and you could get different answers depending on which level you're looking at. And because everyone has different priorities and different things. So often when you're looking at your scope of your thing, if you're making some tactical decision, there may be a different decision than you're making a strategic decision. So it's understanding that there is it's recognizing that there's different perspectives, and those perspectives are actually valid, and it can often be in competition with each other. And so it's understanding that that's built in, and understanding that at this level, here's the optimal solution, but at this level, this is the optimal solution. And it's up to the decision maker to say, where do I want to optimize? Do I want to optimize up here, or do I want to optimize down here? And there could be different sets of answers to that question.
Thank you. Actually, before we move on, I see Nick was nodding. I don't know if it was pained or delighted, but Nick, do you want to add anything to what Rob was saying?
I'm glad Rob handled that question. He did a great job.
They don't get any easier, though. So another question is,
if you want to give me,
please go ahead, Kumar.
Opportunity. So I think you have to look at the situation. So if you take something like the fixed services area, right? Typically, long-range microwave links operate at say 5 nines of reliability, and when they're dimensioned. But that reliability is actually calculated on or availability. That availability is characterized on the basis of margins that are built into the system that account for precipitation, atmospheric effects, other tail effects that may occur over the course of. And in certain situations, some of those impairments that the wireless channel is going to be subject to might occur in concert. But most of the time they may not. There'll always be excess margin available. So the question really is, in assessing risk, you may want to find out, what is the harm to the system if we assume that not more than a percentage of that margin will be required at a particular time. Mm-hmm. And these calculations are very rarely done in the design of the system or in the way the service itself is organized. So if you look at some of the requirements that come out of the ITU on what sort of interference levels are acceptable for, say, satellite systems, they say, you have to have interference floors that are 12 dB below the noise floor. Now in the US, we have reinterpreted that as saying, okay, it's enough if we are only 6 dB below the noise floor, and nobody has complained. On the other hand, you take the mobile industry, and we thrive on being able to accept interference. Mm-hmm. But there are certain situations where tail effects actually can be pretty harmful to your system. So you could, for instance, take a 5G system that is deployed in a factory, and there you can end up losing a production line for days if a single link is damaged.
Yeah.
Right. You really have to think about this in terms of what the impact is on your mission at the end.
Right. So actually, one of the things, Kumar, and maybe we'll touch on this briefly and come back. I'm wondering about what is changing that is bringing these risk conversations to the fore. Why are we talking about this in Spectrum now? And I think the example that you gave just a moment ago might be one of them. The cellular industry is now dealing, selling products to people who do safety of life services, factory floors, etc. Do you think that affects the willingness to invest the resources to do risk assessment and management?
I think so, or at least I hope so. But really, I mean, you have to think of it. I mean, a lot of what the cellular industry is trying to do is also based on aspiration. So, for instance, when cellular technologies are not being used for automation in the transportation sector or automation in industry, it's because of all the uncertainties that are created by the fact that people don't know what they can trust. So we haven't really gotten to the point where we are able to assess or at least define the level of risk in particular use cases and be able to differentiate between them properly. Yes.
Yeah, Omar, I want to sort of get your perspective from, the view from the bridge. When you look at, your community, how does this kind of multiple ways of understanding risk and mission? You've created a framework where it's very straightforward. FDA, there are 4 risk categories, pick one. Does that solve the problems for you?
It helps. I don't think there is a perfect solution out there yet, but it certainly helps. And at the core of this framework and of this entire conversation, and I think this is a theme across all the other ideas that we've been discussing, is what is harm? And this goes back to a question that you asked me not too long ago about how do you define harm? And I think I'm just lucky because I live in a world where harm is defined and I know what harm means from the medical device perspective. It's the physical injury or damage to the health of people. So I have a reference point to go back to when thinking about, okay, how do I deal with a certain device trying to access the channel when there are multiple systems trying to access that same channel at the same time. So it always goes back to what will happen if that communication fails to go through. If the communication is intended to request a glass of water by a patient from a nurse station, then yeah, that risk is negligible, to be honest. If the consequences is the failure to deliver a high priority alarm in an ICU unit, then we should start thinking, okay, how do we mitigate that risk? Do we need to actually build in the device further mitigations, further communication capabilities other than wireless in many cases, just to mitigate that risk of the communication being lost?
I mean, one of the questions, if I understand it correctly, in the Q&A is, or observation, that risk changes with point of view and with time. In 4 dimensions, where you are, what time it is. It's not static. How do you handle? How does your approach handle that, or is it not relevant?
I don't think at the time we look at risk being fluid with time. So at the moment of the analysis, when the medical device manufacturer performs their risk assessment and they determine all the hazards, all the consequences, and they start to think about probability and severity, and they walk through the process to the point where they say, okay, the risk for this certain wireless functionality in a medical device is minor. That really concludes that risk analysis, and then they are offload it to an actual testing. They go to a test
Okay.
lab, or they
Okay.
build a test in-house, and they perform their evaluation over there.
Okay. One of the thing, another question in the Q&A, which is, can we, federal and commercial users, agree on key performance indicators that degrade as a measure of harm? And so for all of you that have looked at this, when you think about how do you quantify the impact, how do you do that? And do you think that it works? Actually, Kelly, maybe we should start with you, since I know you've thought hard about impact.
I think it's a contentious issue, certainly, about key performance indicators and the parameters that you would look at to derive those key performance indicators. I keep gravitating back to the technical parameters issue. If you really believe that quantifying risk is possible, then we ought to look at those key performance indicators as the kinds of, I guess, things like bid error rates and technical parameters that genuinely can affect system performance, and try to identify all of them that are in play and represent them in some way. And I hearken back to the IEEE 1900.2 that divided the parametric space into logical domain parameters and physical domain parameters. But the point being that, without going through the whole list, there's lots of them, but you can select from that list a bunch of parameter combinations that could be related to key performance parameters that I think we can all agree on. In other words, a certain bit error rate that occurs only so often would be acceptable for TV, for instance, and that we've done that. Those kinds of things have been done. And I think it takes a lot of work, and we have to be willing to look at the full parameter set that's relevant, not just one figure like interference to noise ratio at the front end of a receiver or something, and look at trying to agree among the stakeholders which ones are relevant to put into the process of quantifying risk. And that means find the ones that have lots of variability that affect your key performance parameters as a whole, and quantify them statistically. And so agree on that. I think we've made some progress, and to a certain extent we already have. We still have lots to go, right?
So you asked the question, and I wasn't sure whether it was a rhetorical question. It was an assumption. You said, if quantifying risk is possible. So I'll ask you this question, Kelly, and then I'll ask Nick the same question. Is it possible to quantify risk? And is it desirable to quantify risk?
Yeah, I think it's desirable and it's possible. But my definition of risk goes like this: realism on the likelihood axis, then choose from the consequences part of the axis what number you're willing to live with. If you don't have realism to start with on that axis, and you don't have confidence in your confidence intervals, if you'll excuse the pun, but then you might as well not be dealing with risk. And let me illustrate by, if I could, just for 1 minute.
Yeah, and actually with your illustration, could you also address, when you say realism, what does realism mean?
That means using realistic parameters that are representative of what might actually happen in both the physical and logical domain. Propagation loss, for instance, we don't use the worst case propagation loss. We look at the statistics of propagation through a forest, for instance, and we look at measurements to validate our models. And we're getting better and better at that. I have confidence that we are getting good enough to be able to do this already. And then you pick a mean and a standard deviation around that and a shape, and you've described that part of the math that's necessary to quantify that particular variable parameter. And you do that for all the parameters, including things like the dynamic power control in an LTE, or the probability of changing modulation indices in LTE in a given resource block. There's a lot of parameter space to cover, but you can quantify that part of it. It takes a lot of work and a lot of data. My feeling is it's worth it, right? So,
Okay.
Could I just take one more minute? One of the things I hope for, and I'm so confident that this is starting to show promise, is that in an operational setting in military operations, we may be able to envision being able to quantify risk of RF interactions for the commander to use to make near real-time operational decisions. And to illustrate that, if you're confronted with a situation that says, do I send a squad in there to knock out a command post? Do I jam them? Or do I listen to them to find out what they're doing, which might be even more effective? 2 out of 3 of those, if we're really good at quantifying these technical parameters and the distributions and the shapes and the means and the standard deviations, we can assign, hopefully, values to the chances of success for those electronic cyber type options. And when you're making a decision like sending a squad in versus these other measures, there's huge consequences on deciding wrong. And that boils right back to what I started with, and that is, if you don't have realism in the likelihood axis, you're going to make a lot of bad decisions, one way or the other.
Nick, so the same question I asked Kelly for you, which is, is it possible? Is it desirable to quantify risk? Compare and contrast quantitative versus qualitative.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd love to hear Rob's thoughts about a risk matrix, right?
Yeah,
Yes,
let's go there.
So Rob, yeah, it's
happy to chime in. It's all about the level of fidelity needed. And so a risk matrix is very useful when you have a defined program that you're trying to manage in a project program, context. It does not work when you're trying to do comparative things. It does not work when you're trying to do some other of these probabilistic kind of modeling things. So it's understanding the kinds of things that you're trying to do. Now, can you quantify things? Yes. Is it desirable? Yes. Now it's all about how much fidelity do you need, and how much confidence do you need in that to make that decision? Remember, people get stuck up and say, I need more data, more data, more data. Well, do you really need the more data to make that decision, or do you just want that more data? Yeah. And really the difference from qualitative to quantitative, it's really just you have more data to back up that qualitative assessment. We're talking about risk. Risk is something that may or may not happen in the future. So therefore, by its very nature, it's not certain. It is, we're talking uncertainty here. So data can give you more predictive nature of that and can help you get more confidence of that, but that's still a qualitative nature because you have to translate that data into a risk measure. People think, I've looked at tons of risk models over there and they say, I have all this things. It's like, here's the bit rate loss. So it's like, who cares? What does that mean from a mission context? What does that mean to that spectrum device? What does that mean from what we're trying to do? Yes, we should be able, as Callie was saying, properly characterize the probability of that being disrupted. Absolutely. And we want to have good models of that. But that's not the end of the day. We need to then take that to what does that mean if that gets disrupted or degraded? I need to understand that. And then I can have different risk tolerances. Getting back to the point of view question and the KPI questions that we're talking about a few minutes ago, we can have different risk tolerances for a particular KPI. Some people may like, no, I can only operate within this band of variability. Others can accept a much larger band. It depends on what kind of device it is It depends on what kind of mission is being executed. And so all these point of view things actually do matter when you're characterizing risk. And so you can structure these, you can create models, you can create risk appetite and tolerance. There's all kinds of techniques and stuff that you can do this, especially around KPIs. And so those are the kind of things that you can set and, and address and adjust over time, depending on what kind of decisions being made.
So Nick, how does that strike you? Does that resonate with what your experience has been?
Yeah, and I do want to even pull back from what I think it was one of the economists, I think it was Greg, that talked about, risk appetite, risk tolerance. Now that I'm glad Rob brought that up, but it does tie back to enforcement, right? And the economists told us this, right? So yes, could we increase the agency's risk appetite if, we had a mechanism that resolved interference within 1 minute, right? Because traditionally, yes, it's very hard in some bands. It's a manual process, right? So I'm glad he talked about that. And I love how Rob talked about, yes, how much data do we need, right? Do we have more than we already have? Do we run the sensitivity analysis on the model, right? Decreasing that uncertainty, if it doesn't change the output, who cares, right? But if it is a sensitive input, well, yes, we do need to go out and reduce our uncertainty in that. So yeah, I think it's great. Rob talked about that. And again, the transparency and things like that. So yes, I think it's great that DoD and the other agencies are doing their risk assessment, right? But again, you can't do it in a silo, right? Because one big uncertainty to them might be, oh, well, if we do share this band, what type of rules will the FCC make, right? Now, the uncertainty is the FCC. So could DoD or the agency share it in IRAC, right? So all the agencies are learning risk management together, right? Because it's going to be hard, right? This is not going to be easy, right? We'd love to bring Rob into the IRAC and walk us through this as an agency, but then of course, then we share that with FCC and we have sharing mechanisms for classified material, right? So how could the FCC then reduce some of those uncertainties for the agencies, right? Does it look at out-of-band emission, limiting those, right, to help the agencies take on more of a risk appetite? So I think what Rob says is, great. Yes, we can't do this alone. Let's pull people in. Let's try and share it together. But
the thing that I just want to throw in, and this is not a specific question, but anybody can pick up on it later or in their remarks. Rob, you were talking about, what's the meaning of some risk? And one of the points that Prasad Kadambi, the NRC person, was educating me about was the difference between uncertainty and ambiguity. And the reason I was reminded about that is when you talk about meaning, it's like STEM educated folks are really not good with meaning. You need some people who are trained in the humanities to, to puzzle over those issues, because it's presumably not all quantifiable. Does anybody want to briefly respond to that, and then we'll go back to Q&A from the audience?
And so you're talking about like non-stationary versus stationary processes. Is that what you're getting at?
I don't think so, and we don't have Prasad here to answer. But what I think about it, it's almost Knightian uncertainty. It's not something you can put a number on. And so, in that sense, whether it's stationary or non-stationary, I don't know enough statistics to answer.
I mean, there are ways to characterize things. Even if you look at social sciences, you look at all kinds of things. Survey research and other kinds of stuff. They do it all the time. So there are ways to characterize it and quantify things on that. There's a whole body of research on how you go about doing that. And especially when you look at societal benefits, societal, all the kind of thing like that. So not all of it is quantifiable and monetizable. It's like how do you actually go about doing that? So there are ways to actually characterize them. We do these all the time, and trade studies and other kinds of AOAs and other kind of stuff, where we're looking at not only the risk and the cost, but what are the benefit and how do we characterize that benefit. Sometimes you have very specific performance parameters that you're measuring, and you can have a really engineering differential on that. Other times it's no. What is the adoption rate of a particular kind of activity now that we have this in the place, and what kind of impact does that have on quality of life or other kinds of stuff? If you look in the medical field, you look at qualities and lifetime qualities and other kinds of stuff that is are measurable things that are quantifying something that is more abstract and less concrete than what a lot of engineers like to deal with.
So let me turn back to the Q&A. We're not going to get to all of them, and some of them I'm having trouble parsing, and some of them are more rhetorical than interrogatory. Let me combine a couple of questions, and again, these are jump balls. The first is, what is an instance or an example of a success case for spectrum sharing? And I presume the question meant doing a risk analysis for spectrum sharing. And then the second question is actually the forward-looking one, which is, what spectrum sharing scenario or band would be a good choice for the NTIA, and I would add for the FCC or anybody else, to perform a risk-informed interference analysis? And how would that result in better use of the spectrum resource? So does anybody want to talk about successes and opportunities? Yes, Nick.
I can give an attempt, yeah.
Oh, I was going to say,
and then Kumar.
Harkening back to Fred again, he's talked about bidirectional sharing, right? And I think it was even Carolyn that talked earlier about, well, the spectrum pipeline is unsustainable, right? As we know it, because we've typically taken federal spectrum, transferred it to non-federal, right? So it would be a great risk assessment, forward-looking, if we could see allowing the federal agencies to operate between, for example, 2 to 20 gigahertz on an NIB basis in the non-federal bands, right?
NIB?
We would love to see something like that. Non-interference basics. So, for example, say, we have Kumar there, whether it's a telco operating in the C-band, right? But say they aren't using it in the desert at night, right? That might be a great opportunity for another agency to then use that spectrum, right, from 3.7 to 4. And then when we think about the benefits that would provide someone like DoD, right? Because again, Fred talked about, we're going into these other theaters. Yeah, imagine the flexibility that gives. So again, yeah, I think that would be
what I'm hearing is that's the value of sharing. Mm-hmm. How would risk assessment help do it better?
So I think we could look at the statistics again of a single DoD system and how that would interfere with base stations, right? With a wireless terrestrial network. We'd love to do that with the FCC, right? Again, we aren't looking at this aggregate interference, so it does simplify the analysis for us.
Right.
Because again, it could possibly be a radar that's rotating, in the time dimension.
So it's great. The conversation is just beginning to warm up. So we've got Kumar is next, and actually, Omar, I'd like to ask you then whether there are any case studies that you felt were particularly successful in the work that you've done that we as a community, as a broader spectrum community, can learn from. And then Callie had a point as well. So Kumar first.
Yeah. So I mean, I guess the question was about examples of where spectrum sharing has actually occurred, and I always have this story that I present to people. So even if you take the commercial mobile industry, we do share spectrum in the sense that when you go back to the old analog telephone days, we used to distribute the spectrum that was awarded to an operator across 7 cell groups and 21 sectors, and not there wouldn't be any spectrum in adjacent territories being used by the same system. Whereas you fast forward over to 3G, 4G, and 5G, and now we use spectrum across the entire system, the same spectrum reused in every cell all along the way. And not only that, we have more advanced computing going into all our infrastructure. So now we can share spectrum simultaneously, even from the same cell site, between users and between between using advanced antenna systems and so on. Now, I mean, but the way to look at this is what we have engineered as a highly spectrum efficient system, right? We are able to what we cannot guarantee a spectrum utility. The only thing that guarantees spectrum utility from our industry's viewpoint is the market, and how many people are utilizing the spectrum that gets auctioned to an operator, in a particular area. If you take the unlicensed bands, there are a variety of use cases that are already, coexisting. Bluetooth and Wi-Fi and so many other systems, they manage to coexist in the 5 gigahertz and 2.4 gigahertz bands, and now, of course, the 6 gigahertz band has been released. So there is a fair amount of spectrum sharing that goes on over there. Between services, there's many examples. The 6 gigahertz band shares with fixed services. And then there, the classic example, of course, in recent times is CBRS, where we share spectrum in a 3-tier process. And, I can find, I worked on CBRS for many years, so I can criticize it to no end about what was not done. But what is also clear is that it has created a very innovative experiment on trying to examine what the realms of possibility are over there. And it's probably a good example to use, because if there are problems with the system, that can be changed. I think one of the issues with regulation is
could you just wrap that up, Kumar? Just finish your thought.
Yeah, the thought is that, one of the problems with regulation is that it gets enshrined in law and then it becomes immutable. So to some extent, we have to allow ourselves the latitude to make mistakes and then to fix them later on. That is very essential. And that is perhaps something that we have not accounted for in our processes yet.
And I think that goes to the whole conference. And that's a very good point. So Omar, just turning to you, and I think we're about 15 minutes out from the end, so we're not going to get to all the excellent questions in the Q&A. Thank you, everybody, for those. Let's see how far we get. So Omar, when you look at what's worked in your field, what are the lessons that we should take from that going forward?
All right. So a quick comment on what worked is that I personally consider, regardless of how chaotic things are in the 2.4 gigahertz ISM band, but I consider it a very, very successful example. It has allowed for so many innovations in the medical device space, and those innovations are helping patients every single day. So that in itself is a success. I think one of the lessons learned that I want to share with my colleagues here on the panel and with the audience of the conference is that not all devices are created equal, even if they are using the same technology. So when you're talking Bluetooth, two devices could be using the same Bluetooth chipset in a completely different way. And the outcome of evaluating how these devices coexist with Wi-Fi could lead to vastly different realizations. So what I'm trying to say is that there is value to looking at what the system, the overall system, the spectrum-dependent system that you're dealing with is trying to achieve, not only from the bit error rate perspective or from a certain specific KPI, but from across the 7 OZ layers and all the software that is built on top of the RF hardware that is embedded in that system.
So let me just make sure that I understand, Omar, because one way of interpreting what you said is that because devices vary so much from one device to another, and particularly when we're doing risk assessment forward looking, we're thinking in terms of classes of devices, some of which may not even exist yet. It sounds, one way of interpreting what you said is like you're doomed. It ain't gonna work because you can't look at specific devices. But you're not saying that. I think you're saying
No,
fix it
not
higher in the
necessarily.
stack.
Exactly, or at least broaden your scope to include additional layers in the stack.
Yeah, right. Thank you. Callie, you've waited very patiently. Can you still remember what you wanted to say?
Oh, I just wanted to pile on with what Nick said, and I thought the example of success of certainly AWS3 in my mind, just because I think it did demonstrate sharing could work in two ways, where the incumbent was the DoD, and in the case of sharing with the broadcasters, the incumbent was the broadcasters, or two instances where sharing worked. And Nick's use case of going all the way to 20 gigahertz and saying, look, you're welcome to come in on a non-interference basis. That would be a wonderful, challenging problem for these risk assessment. It'd be almost a given that we have to do a realistic quantification of the risk on a band by band basis for doing that. So I applaud the idea. I'd love to work on it.
So let me just put a few of the things in the Q&A channel on the table, and I, invite you to respond to any of them. Just looking at a few of them. One is, how do you handle an impact that a user feels is not acceptable, regardless of its low frequency? Do you continue to do risk analysis in some other form, or does it leave you no room to do that? Another question is, risk-based interference assessment usually would require data that doesn't exist or that would be hard to collect in future. Actually, for those of us who remember, Ed Thomas always used to love to say there are no facts in the future. How do you quantify risk when partial or erroneous data itself could be a source of risk? Another question, which is short and sweet, does the FCC need a risk assessment and mitigation bureau? And the last one I'll throw out here is, how much benefit comes from just doing the quantitative analysis versus the result itself? The attempt to do quantitative analysis could inform the qualitative analysis for the good.
Yeah.
Any thoughts about any of those? And actually, Rob, we'll start with you, and go from there.
Okay, so first off, on the first question on there is like, if the result is unacceptable, there's still risk analysis to be conducted, because how big of a margin do you need to prevent that? How big of an exclusion zone, or how big of whatever. There's a lot of different parameters you can look at that you can minimize the use of spectrum to still preserve that and make sure that unacceptable result doesn't happen. And then another thing about it, so that's just one thing on that. On the data piece, it really depends on what you're trying to do. And I'm going to throw in, we're going to have some challenges coming down the pipe in the risk space and spectrum as you increase the number of dynamic spectrum devices in the field, as well as things with frequency hopping and other kind of spectrum things in combination with spectrum sharing. Is like, how do you do those analyses? So those are more complex because a lot more data and it's much more complex to model. But I do think that having those models can inform some qualitative measures. So it's like having those detailed models that Callie was talking about earlier, and other games that has that high fidelity kind of stuff can be used as a proxy and a value function on some other kinds of things that you're trying to do that are more qualitative in nature. So you can leverage some of your detailed kind of analyses on the kind of thing, but ultimately as we're looking out across the things and understanding how things interact with each other, like I like to call it the coupling risk. How does this impact that? And a number of different things. It's like, what are those things? You can leverage those to inform other assessments. So it's not that they have value outside of the isolated use that they were initially conducted for, but they can be used to inform other kind of analyses that are maybe not in depth or as much detail as that original one was.
Anybody else want to chime in on any of those topics?
I think when you're doing an analysis of risk, you have to make sure that you're at least good enough, where you're in the ballpark of where you want to be, and then try to improve. I mean, there's always a possibility that you're going to be, you're going to make some mistakes along the way, but those mistakes should be should not be to an extent where a lot of money has been invested in equipment or in systems being deployed, and for policy to be backtracked along the way. That being said, if the level of risk is completely unacceptable to somebody, the question you have to ask is, what is it worth to you? And really then it becomes a question of, what is the economic benefit of giving you the facility to have a certain degree of use versus to society. It need not be only to the user of the spectrum. It could be to society as a whole, or to the application under use in any case.
What
that
happens
is why
when the
you
party?
have
I'm sorry.
right? Yeah.
What happens
go
when
ahead.
the party? What happens when the party you're negotiating with can't take money?
We do end up in situations like that, and that's why you have governments in charge of apportioning spectrum for use, and at some point in time, the regulator is the last arbiter of
Right.
of Brexit, right? Yeah.
Kelly?
Well, I think you're starting to drift into the legal framework of whether or not exclusive rights should even exist. That's a big question, but whoever asked that question implies that you've still got exclusive rights. That's antithetical to sharing across different user groups and different types of equipment. But it's a key legal question about whether exclusive rights to spectrum in an unlimited sense can just exist. You can buy it, you can have it, you have a license, and even if you're not using it, you can tell everyone else not to use it.
Yes, that gets us into, as you say, legal areas about what rights do you have? Even in a spectrum sharing situation, parties have different rights. There are different tiers of rights that need to be negotiated. One of the things I just wanted to skip back, and in a few moments I will ask all five of you if you have any parting thoughts, and you don't have to. But one of the many things that was teed up that we didn't really have time to talk about, I want to skip back to. There was that question of whether the FCC needs a risk assessment and mitigation bureau, but actually, Kumar, you were saying it's interesting. You were mentioning some of the European processes, and you wondered whether there was room for a stakeholder forum in the US. And I wondered if you and let's sort of, it can be for spectrum coexistence, but let's narrow it down to the kind of technical analysis that we've been talking about here. Could you say a little bit more about what that might look like in brief, and then other folks can just respond to that?
I mean, ideally, I think it would be where there is free exchange of information between the stakeholders, agreements on the models to be used, some sort of an understanding of the risk to each entity that is it doesn't have to be the same risk for every party, right? But they have to they can put everything on the table, right, from economic risk out to what happens if the spectrum is not available, and then it's a matter of creating the right kinds of dialogue between these parties, and the quantitative evaluation can definitely be part of this, but it will not end up being the sole reason for making regulatory decisions on.
And to channel my guru, Dale, so what are the incentives that people would have to participate in good faith?
Oh, I mean, in some sense, so I'll tell you, one of the roadblocks that people will face is that this is tedious work. And typically, it's very difficult to find even companies who will assign enough resources to be able to serve this purpose. Not to mention just the government. I know that, for instance, when the NTIA does evaluations, they're severely understaffed, and there's incredible amount of effort that goes on into the studies that they do, but at the same time there's also a lot that does not get done, and in the same way, you're going to end up in situations where you're going to end up in resource limitations on how effectively you can conduct these studies. The second issue, of course, would be in transparency, as we have talked about before. I won't dwell too much on it.
Yep.
But
yeah.
But you can set up agencies. Maybe ATIS is one route, or maybe SysMac is another route if you're looking at interfaces with federal spectrum. So there are many other opportunities available, but you have to have a more open attitude towards sharing information and admitting inputs from everybody.
Very good. Thank you. So in the last 2 minutes, let's just go down the line, Rob, Omar, Nick, and Kali, the rest of the line. Do you have any parting sound bites for us on this topic, Rob?
Yeah. So my parting thing is that it's not only risk analysis, it's risk management. And so we've been talking about risk analysis. Which need to inform policies, or procedures, system designs, and other things that actually reduce risk. And so we can't just stop at the analysis step. We need to continue on and actually address the other pieces. Otherwise, we're not going to realize the benefit we're seeking to realize.
Thank you. Omar.
Absolutely. I completely agree with what Rob said. And I want to highlight the value of engaging stakeholders to certain applications and engaging the opinion of subject matter experts for what a certain system is trying to achieve. And those SMEs might be different between different industries, and they're not necessarily related to spectrum at all.
Thank you. Nick?
Oh man, thanks again for having us. Thanks again, guys, for the spirited debate. We support peer review, right? Transparency, scientific reproducibility, right? We're hoping that that the different stakeholders can at least share the data with the federal regulators, right? Do the wireless industry need to agree on what DoD is using for their radar interference margins, right? Well, who's the SME, right, in that case? Who's the subject matter on the radar, right? And so again, it's pulling radar and the subject matter experts to the table to let them characterize their systems. While on the other hand, a large uncertainty, at least that we see now, for example, in the current 3.1 gigahertz study, right? It's this uncertainty of, well, what are the use cases of 5G in this band if it were allowed, right? So again, we rely heavily now on that SME experience from industry, right? So again, it's coming together. The hope is that we can share data, right? And it's the innovation theme that we hear over and over again, right? John Chapin from NSF talked about innovation Canadian representative. Yeah, and so it is encouraging innovation through using the risk assessment.
So we are out of time. Kelly, do you have one sentence that you want to leave us with?
Yeah, we had a good experience with the stakeholders cooperating in AWS3. And the way forward to me is to have stakeholders have confidence in our confidence intervals. If you don't have that, you're going to have a long hill to climb.
Well said. Thank you to the organizers for inviting us and enabling us to have this conversation. Thank you to everybody in the audience for paying attention. If you were paying attention, and I can see you were, because we had a lot of good questions, not all of which we were able to address. But in particular, thank you to the 5 panelists who not only gave us the time you've just seen, but they all did a lot of prep work too. So thank you to all of them, and we're out. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.